Alrighty, welcome. Thanks for having me, y'all. So my name is Ken Lane. I'm an API evangelist. I don't evangelize any single API. I evangelize them all. So I don't work for any individual company. I'm going to talk to you today about moving towards a modern API lifecycle. So who am I? What do I do? I'm a database architect. I started building databases in 86, 87. Fast forward that to the web, I'm building database-driven apps. Fast forward that to the cloud, I'm working at SAP and I'm building distributed database-driven apps driving mobile infrastructure. And 2009, I got sick of working at SAP and I started a blog in 2010 called APIevangelist.com. And I started studying the business of APIs. I quickly saw that there were plenty of pundits talking about the REST and all the other technical aspects of APIs. And I didn't want to play in that game, even though I can. So I focused on the business of APIs. Along the way, I started working on what I consider the politics of APIs, everything from terms of service all the way up to regulation and public policy. So 2010 through 2015, I lived here in San Francisco, spent a lot of time at startups. You find me at hackathons, really evangelizing a lot of different API startups, API management providers like Apogee, 3Scale, Mashery, all of those. Co-founder of API Strat, the conference, which is now in the Linux Foundation. But now, 2016 through 2020, you find me more in New York City, in Europe, and in DC, evangelizing and working on federal systems. So I'm working on Department of Veterans Affairs, helping them with their Lighthouse API program. So more enterprise level APIs, a little less startups, even though I still work closely with startups like Postman, Appomatic, and others. You can find all of my research for the last 8 years on my website, and all the stops along the API lifecycle that I'm talking about today are there. And I'm the one that, when she was talking earlier, you'll find almost 100 stops along the API lifecycle on my blog. Each stop is its own GitHub repo. It's machine readable. So each stop along the lifecycle is forkable by itself. And like I said, it's 8 years worth of research. Sometimes it's a little messy, but if you follow my blog, I try to make sense of it in real time. So I'm going to focus on a consistent API lifecycle, which I help enterprise groups try to do and focus on. So I work with banks. I'm working on the PSD2 coming out of Europe. I'm working on with healthcare providers, fast healthcare interoperability requirements, or FHIR. I'm working on, as I said, Department of Veterans Affairs, which is using the FHIR specification as well. So I work with groups to try to streamline their life cycle and deliver microservices and APIs as quickly and efficiently and consistently as possible. So every API or microservice that I build and work on starts with an API definition. Starts with an open API as the contract, and then I quickly develop or translate that into Postman collections to create a dev time, a run time, an integrate time, contract or representation of that contract for working with those services. I also start creating an API's JSON file, which is a machine readable discovery format. Swagger Hub uses it, Fitbit, trade.gov. You'll find API's JSON in the roots of their domains, and it's basically a home document that describes the overall API operations, not just the API itself. I leave that to Postman and OpenAPI. I'm also the only individual on the Open API initiative. I'm right there with IBM and Google and all the others. I've been an early supporter of Swagger and now Open API, and I work hard to get the word out about it. I'm also a big supporter of Postman. I've been a big fan of Postman since they first came onto the scene. Every API definition immediately goes into a repository, whether it's GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. Every API starts as a README, a set of definitions in a repo. And then I move into the design phase. And then I start designing the paths around those, whatever those resources are. A lot of times I end up with a lot of schemas dumped into a GitHub repo from some backend system or backend existing API, SOAP service, or existing third-party API. And then I start designing from that and working with that API. Because I work in government, Sometimes the default response from my APIs are CSV. Increasingly, they're JSON, but I still allow people to negotiate a CSV response of representations. Because in government, if you allow people to go from API call to a spreadsheet, you're going to have a lot more supporters than if you're out there pushing just JSON. Trust me, I've done a lot of work in this arena. I also let people still negotiate XML on a lot of my APIs. But then I also have a pretty wide API design toolbox. I'm not just a Restafarian. I actually start with RESTful resources, but then I actually allow people to negotiate hypermedia resources. I use Siren, I use HAL, JSON LD if I'm going more semantic and linked data and getting more specific in my work. I'm also increasingly allowing and extending and adding GraphQL endpoints to allow people, when I have specific development audiences, I allow them to negotiate exactly the responses that they want for their client experience. So I take all of those designs. I would add webhooks. I'm increasingly doing more event-driven architecture and webhooks in there as well. But my API design toolbox is pretty robust. I have a versioning strategy from the day one. There is no right way to version your APIs. I will not be prescribing any particular approach to API versioning. There is the only wrong way of versioning your API is not to have a plan at all. And that plan could be not to version. Actually, I think Netflix does very well with their strategy to not version their APIs, but they have a plan. So have a plan in place to how you're going to version your APIs, how you're going to version your code, and how you're going to version your schema along the way. API virtualization. So I'm talking about mocking. I'm talking about creating sandbox environments. So mock your APIs from the first stage. Take your definitions, turn them into mocks, and also don't just focus on the APIs themselves. Actually virtualize and provide mock data. Next iteration of the Department of Veterans Affairs will have synthesized veterans records as part of their sandbox. Well, they don't call it a sandbox, they call it a lab, because we're government, and I don't know why they do that. But it's using a platform called Cynthia, which is synthetic records data for healthcare, but it's like 500 separate veterans records that actually have histories, fought in different wars, have different ailments, ages, whole personalities to the records. So don't just virtualize your APIs, virtualize your data. Portals. I'm increasingly including portals within the pipeline. I'm deploying Jekyll to GitHub as a portal. I'm using any number of other static website tool other than Jekyll, but increasingly our portals are part of the pipeline, and I'm deploying them internally. I'm deploying them for specific partner implementations, as well as a public portal to rule them all. Documentation is part of that portal definition. So increasingly, I'm, all my API docs are open API driven. They're interactive, and they allow me to include that in my pipeline. It's not just Swagger UI anymore. I'm using Redoc, any number of other LucyBot. There's a whole bunch of other open source, open API driven solutions, as well as Postman has their solution for deploying documentation right out of the tool. Integrate with teams, work with teams, talk to your teams, share your open API definitions and Postman collections with your teams, be collaborative, have an efficient API lifecycle. And what I mean by efficient is repeat everything that I just talked about and work with your teams before you ever deploy. If you can move to an API first way of doing things, you're going to be much more efficient, you're much more cost effective. Even though I say this with the reality, knowing that most of the groups I still work with are generating open API definitions and Postman collections from their code, but it's still an inefficient way of doing things. And the groups that I'm working with who have gone to an API first strategy are much more cost effective. And so in the process, they're also able to make their API deployment much more modular because they've already mocked them and deployed them and iterated on the contract many times over before they got to that deployment cycle. Containerization, serverless, cloud services, gateways are all valid ways of deploying that contract, deploying it as an actual API for production. You can use services to auto-gen your server-side code, or you can go the artisanal route and handcraft your code when it is necessary. Paying attention to dependencies, talking about back-end system and software dependencies, other service dependencies, as well as people dependencies. Increasingly, I'm adding a X- collection into my open APIs to actually define what are my back-end dependencies. This actually is a facade for a SOAP service. This is actually using an IBM DB2 stored procedure that has one guy named Bob who's retiring next year, and I actually need to do something about this dependency before Bob goes away, because we have no more DB2 developers at the IRS. We do, but we don't have that many. I'm tracking on dependencies and making that part of the machine-readable contract, because those dependencies, I need to talk to them anytime I make changes to what I'm doing. And hopefully they're talking to me when they're making changes, because I'm regularly communicating with them. As I said, all my services are using a pipeline. I'm able to recreate, make everything that I do repeatable. Using Jenkins primarily, but there are groups using Circle CI and other CI/CD solutions. But every service operates and lives within a pipeline. Always a common OAuth strategy. If it's simple, basic data, I see a lot of people still using basic auth. API keys, if it's personally identifiable information, personal health information, you're using OAuth, microservices within the enterprise, JWT. Again, a lot of this, your OAuth scopes, a lot of these definitions can be defined from your Open API contract. Centralized common API management strategy. You can be using different gateways. I work with groups who are using MuleSoft alongside Kong, but having a common strategy for how you manage those APIs and what you require of services when it comes to registering and being part of your management solution. You just need to have a common plan. You can have many different tools. Ideally, you have one gateway or one management solution, but never find that to be the case because of acquisitions, because of different personalities on teams. You end up with different solutions being purchased. If management bought it, they're probably using MuleSoft. If the development team is doing it, they're using Kong and Tyke or one of the other solutions. AWS Gateway being somewhere in the middle. Logging everything. Require all my services to log ship the DNS logs, the management logs, the web server logs, as well as the backend database for the service. Ship them to a single location, wrap them, index them with Elasticsearch, launch an API, make that API part of the stack. You now have all of your logs in an API that you can audit and work with directly from any system or application. Have a monetization strategy in place. I'm not talking about just making money. I'm talking about having the building blocks of your monetization in place. What's your compute costs? What's your storage costs? What's your database costs? What's your DNS costs? These are all modular costs if you're running in the cloud. If you're running on Azure or Amazon or Google, you should know what these costs. You should have them broken down by each service and have them in a machine-readable way so that you can calculate what your costs are per service and across services and groups of services. Have a plan. This plan should work with your API management service, your solution, and you should be putting different APIs into different plans. I don't care if they're internal APIs, they're partner APIs, or public APIs. All your APIs should operate within plans and should have rate limits applied to them. Think of all the breaches, high-profile breaches we've heard about recently that involved APIs, where people didn't just get away with a couple thousand records, they got away with millions. If you're rate limiting your APIs, you're gonna limit that damage. Measure all API consumption, all paths. Require everyone key up and have a key when they make an API call. Measure those, report on them, send out invoices. I don't care if it's internally, I don't care if it's to partners, I don't care if it's publicly. Invoice everyone. I don't care if cash is being exchanged for those invoices, but you should be reporting to your other departments based upon what their consumption of your resources are. And because you have your monetization strategy, You know what your hard costs are around those resources. You know what their value is. So you should be able to bill other departments and groups on that. I'm increasingly working on this across the federal government. They're starting to learn the value of their data. So if you're building commercial applications on government data right now, be careful, because they're starting to learn what the value is, and they're starting to meter and actually try to fund government operations based upon commercial usage of public data right now. This is happening across Europe, and this is happening across the US. Worked with the Department of Interior, Recreational Information Database, our national park system, trails, all that data and information is increasingly being monetized and made available via APIs. And if you think about it, you can't build a hot dog stand in the Grand Canyon without giving a piece of the action to the government and paying them licensing fees. Increasingly, you're not going to be able to do that on public data. So in the future, the government's going to have a plan around their data, and they're going to be producing more data because of it, and they're actually going to have more revenue because of it. It's not that all public data is going to become not available for free. It's that if you're building a commercial application, you're going to have to actually kick back to the government and help fund what you're using. Monitor all your services. By default, take your open API specification, load it up into RunScope, have it in your Postman, load it up in API Fortress, any monitoring solution. Make sure you're monitoring from multiple regions. Get granular about how you're testing. Add machine-readable assertions to your API definition stack, whether it's Chai or another library. Make sure you're getting very granular in how you're actually testing your APIs, making sure they're doing exactly what they should be doing, make sure they're not doing what they shouldn't be doing. Have those in machine-readable formats, have them indexed as part of your open API and your API's JSON. Measure performance from different regions. Know where your clients are operating from. Measure your own APIs from those regions, and actually have that data available to justify whether your performance is acceptable or not to any of your clients. Take those open API definitions, load them up using OWASP ZAP, scan the surface area of your API. There's increasingly a number of other security services, 42 Crunch, Elastic Beam, different ones that are emerging that take your open API definitions, and they'll scan and understand this surface area of your API, going well beyond just authentication and management. Support. Make sure every microservice has an owner, has a backup owner, and actually has an email and a phone number or some way of getting a hold of them. And there is an accountable person always available for each service to actually provide live support. Make sure they know where the ticket system is. Make sure they understand how to use the ticketing system. Make sure they're communicating about their API. Require every developer to actually go around and educate other team members about their services. Have brown bag lunches, internal meetups, internal gatherings where people communicate around their APIs. The biggest problem I have in the US government is they don't know each other uses their own APIs. I've held gatherings where I've had Department of Commerce, NASA, and Labor in the same group, and they just learned that they're using each other's APIs. And so make sure your groups are actually talking to each other, whether it be a blog, whether it's Twitter, whether it's GitHub, or some sort of internal mechanism. Make sure they're communicating. Share the roadmap. As Avanad did this morning about Postman, make sure you're communicating around what's coming down the road, what you're going to be doing with your APIs. Don't make things a surprise. Make that part of your communication strategy. And then make all of this that I just talked about observable. If you need to know what observable means, look at what Stripe's doing. They communicate about how they test, how they monitor, how they manage performance, how they do things from different regions. They actively share this data with you. Don't hold that stuff close to the chest. Don't be secretive about it. Be very public and observable in all of your actions around your API operations. Have service level agreements for each service. I don't care if they're enforced, I don't care if they're policed, but have a service level agreement and set what expectations are around monitoring, around performance, around testing, around documentation, and make sure you're meeting those goals. Just have a service level agreement, even if you're not gonna enforce it. It's up to you whether you share it with your actual customers or clients, but it's a lot healthier if you do. But even if you just keep them internally, it helps you understand what you're doing right and what you're not. Everything I just talked about, measure. Measure if there's a definition for a service, if they're following the design pattern set forth in your design guide. Hopefully you have an API design guide. Measure if things are being versioned correctly, if they're being deployed. Are there Jenkins files, Docker files present for each of the service? Is there documentation? Is there testing, monitoring? Are all of those being met? Stack those all into a governance strategy. Measure every service and reward based upon it. The next generation of Department of Veterans Affairs APIs are all going to start publicly with an RFI and a README and a GitHub. And then people will bid based upon by submitting an open API contract. And then the people who get awarded the contract will actually build the service and actually deploy it. And if they meet the testing and monitoring, the design requirements, they meet all of the stack that's set out by the governance, they will get paid a higher rate than if they don't meet it, and they'll get more work. So we're actually building governance into not just the technical, but the business side of how you actually deploy services, measuring what's happening. And then after all the technical, don't forget the people, because the most well-designed, well-deployed, technically crafted API will fail when it comes up against culture, internal culture, and people. So if you don't include people in part of all of this journey, business groups, everybody, you're probably going to fail at some point, or you're at least going to stumble and it's not going to be fun. So make sure you're paying attention to people, make sure you're including them at every stop in the life cycle, and to help bridge the canyon that's classically there between IT and business groups. And that's it. That's all I got for you today. Thanks. We'll bring one around for you. Right here in front.
All right, thanks for the talk. In your experience with working with different clients, what will be the percentage of the companies or clients that would actually have all these life cycle?
Very, very few. So I actually have when I go in, I'll ask clients, I'll walk through a talk like this, and as I said, I have 90 stops along my life cycle. I have, regulatory, GDPR, I have all kinds of other things in there. And I'll ask them, I'll kind of have a checklist, and I would say very few even have those. I think there's like 15 there that I went through. I would say, I go in and I'm like, hey, do you guys use Swagger? And they're like, yeah, we use Swagger. They're using it just for docs. That's the primary response. I'm like, are you testing and monitoring your APIs? Management will be like, yeah, we get reports all the time. I go down and audit the lower levels, and they're not really testing, and they're not doing it at a granular level. They're not doing it from different regions. So there's a maturity score that I tend to give organizations based upon how mature, how many of those are. I would say, less than 10% are hitting on even slightly in all those areas. I would say most people are just embarking on their API journey. When I started doing this in 2010, I was like, what is an API? It's pretty much what I did. Now I don't have to do that. Everyone's like, we're doing APIs, we need to do it. How do we do it right? And most are just in the first inning, top of the first inning when it comes to that journey, so. Couple to watch. There's the obvious, API rock stars, Twilio, Stripe, Slack, to watch in the public space, in the public API. But when it comes to private APIs, tune into Netflix, tune into Capital One. Netflix is the most successful API failure out there, in my opinion. Their API, public API totally failed, but all their backend code, all their stories, they're totally transparent and observable about. You can find it on GitHub. They talk about why they do it. You can learn so much from their teams, and they do that because of talent acquisition. They want to hire the best and the brightest. And so Netflix is doing it, Capital One. I've learned a lot from Capital One on the governance side. They have actually governance in place. They're measuring all of those steps. They're hitting in all those steps. The results I don't think are as high as they would want in all of those, in the governance. but those are definitely the ones to watch who are doing more private APIs. I would say out of Europe, because of PSD2, some of the banking stuff we're going to see is going to actually be pretty interesting coming up as well, but with a little regulatory touch.
So for folks that are starting their API journey, of the 15 things that you kind of listed as pretty important across the way, what would you say are the top 3 that they should be focusing on straight away?
Yeah, I mean, Postman reflects that. So it's having a definition, being designed first, mocking, testing, and working with teams. I mean, that before you ever write any code. And I mean, this is what I would say what Postman's doing and enables is what I'm going to be doing a roadshow for the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, I'm on the long game on this. I've been doing this since 2010, like I said, and I was in the SOA services and I was in the Corba, wherever the previous talk went to. So I've seen these cycles play out, and they take a lot longer than we anticipate. And to get people to a design first, we need tooling like Postman, but we also need evangelists out there helping people understand how to navigate it. So I would say definitely definitions, design, mocking, documentation, testing, team collaboration. That's kind of that's where everyone needs to go. No writing of code, because as soon as you start the design process with code, you're immediately in Node.js dogma, PHP dogma, Go dogma, and we have enough dogma in API space with the Rastafarians and the hypermedia and GraphQL. No offense, Guy, but I love GraphQL. I love what it does, but the dogma hurts. And I would say it's hurt REST, it's hurt hypermedia. The linked data folks as well are on the same camp. So,
thank you.
This is a detailed point question, but I'm curious on your perspective. One problem that we had was APIs call other APIs, and when a low-level API gets an error, it's really messed up when it comes up out of the top.
yeah.
Do you have any advice or guidance on how to handle
Yeah, I
that
mean,
scenario?
there's several patterns emerging. I was at a talk last night. The Typeform people were talking about their BFF strategy, the back end for front ends. So basically, how do you create microservices on top of other microservices? So it's really the aggregate APIs or microservices that use the kind of core stack of resources. I would look at back to Netflix, their kind of middle layer, and they have their own, so it's a middle layer that handles the calls and the transformation, the caching, but they have a GraphQL-like layer in there called, I can't remember the name of it, but what Netflix does, their middleware layer has a pretty resilient that allows, works with the whole back-end microservices infrastructure. So I'm starting to see patterns emerge for how people are doing it. I think the mesh network, Istio, Kubernetes. I mean, Kubernetes is definitely, the deployment layer where Istio, and you can start thinking about how your mesh network and how you start building more distributed systems that are more resilient. And yeah, it's a problem. I mean, that's why you got to really think about the dependencies. And I would say, it's easy to say, well, these are upstream, downstream problems, back-end, front-end problems. But really, APIs are increasingly just intermediaries for other, your back-end could be Stripe. I see people taking Stripe and making it their own payment API. I see them being SOAP services. So really, APIs are just intermediaries. And if you just really go into it thinking that all your back-ends are going to fail, and make sure you're testing and monitoring, and you have circuit breakers, you have caching, you have other things in place. Depending on the service, you're gonna be a lot more resilient and happier because of it.
I was curious if you've done a blog or GitHub repository, or are there examples of people who have done a good job of measuring ROI?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. I would say I don't have anything clear to give you. It's a lot tougher because of I would say venture capital and people keeping their cards really close to their chest about who's using their API and what that value is. That's why I'm a big proponent of the value exchange over free, pro, enterprise level plans for your service, like measure value. Yes, have different plans, have your partner and your internal plans, but be measuring value and be observable about that value, because then you're going to be able to measure ROI and understand, what those units of cost that went into it, how many people are using it, what's the value of your data and resources. But then other people in the space are going to learn from you and understand. And that's been one of the biggest damages in the space, is people not sharing their stories because no one's using their API, and they don't want anybody to know it because they've got investors telling them they can't. And so I'm hoping to have more ROI models from doing this in the federal government, because they have a public mandate to be more open and transparent about some of this. The last administration was better than this administration. We'll leave it at that. Hope to get more models there. We need more evangelism. I would say so my API's JSON indexes of APIs include an open API definition or a Postman collection or both. It'll tell you where to sign up for the API. It'll tell you where the terms of service and where the plans and pricing are for an API. I've turned the sign up into a machine readable definition saying how much friction there is. And then the plans and pricing, I've made machine readable definitions based upon like Twilio, SendGrid, and Amazon. And so I have machine readable definitions of what the plans and the pricing are. And so I'm starting to make that more discoverable. And people ask me, one of the top questions I get, people are like, what should I charge for this data that we have or this resource? Who's charging what? So I'm just getting where I'm able to go, well, here's the industries that are doing it, or the companies, and here's how long they've been doing it. And so here's that value of that. These are just the early stages that'll get us to where what your question is, kind of the holy grail. I wish I was there.
Hi. I'm starting to look at this other new API technology. Google did it, gRPC.
gRPC, yeah.
Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, normally I would have that in my toolbox as well right there, because, I would say, REST, basic RESTful resource design, CSV, HTML, XML, JSON, and then hypermedia, HAL, Siren, and then GraphQL. That's kind of the base building blocks of my toolbox. But increasingly, PubSub, server-sent events for streaming APIs. So I do a lot of turning existing APIs into streams, turning them into topical subscriptions for PubSub environments. Webhooks are kind of the 101 of that beginning stage. But those are all starting to, more mature APIs. If you look, one characteristic across Twilios, the Stripes, all of them, is they have webhooks. So that's a sign of a maturing API. They have a lot of activity. They usually have a page that defines what their event types are. So here's the different types of events you can subscribe to with webhooks. The more advanced, or the ones that change rapidly, have streaming. And then in a B2B environment, when you're dealing with high volumes of data that's not a B2C, you see gRPC coming out and protobuf and then Kafka. So that's kind of the spectrum of my toolbox. And depending on the client and what they're capable of, and real detailed assessments of those clients, like I won't just use GraphQL unless I know those clients can deal with GraphQL. But it's the same with gRPC. It's definitely HTTP2. It's using protobuf, which is a much more, serialized messaging. It's much more efficient. Like I said, B2B is where it excels. But you got to know your client audience, because not everyone's going to be up to speed on what HTTP2 is. They're not going to be able to actually take advantage of that. But I really am a big fan of what Google's doing right now, because if you look at all their new APIs, they're all 2-speed. They all have an open API definition, and they have a I'm so bad with names. There's an open source tool for translating from open API to protobuf. And so all their APIs are REST or gRPC. So basically, low or high speed APIs. So when it comes, gRPC is Google's baby, but I think they're playing a nice game when it comes to managing the difference and acknowledging that not everyone's going to need gRPC in these kind of, higher speed. They're paying attention to future B2B, but REST is, B2C in a nice lower level that a wider audience will understand.
last question. By the way, I was just listening to what you said about how it's very important to be API first when it comes to development. You've worked at organizations like IRS, you were saying, or Department of Veterans Affairs, and obviously there, it's like DB2 first or, COBOL first. So what is the advice you give to organizations that are already so entrenched in those systems? Like, how do you advise them to get out of that, and how do you get them to think differently about how to because they can't do it overnight. It's obviously a journey, but how do you get them started on that journey and sort of push them along?
Yeah, that 5-stop kind of initial design phase. So define, design, mock, document, work across teams, and then those tests and those assertions. So I have open API definitions, Postman collections, and usually chai or some other machine-readable assertions. Those are all in the GitHub repo. I'll make sure part of the docs is for the developers and part of it is for business users. And so I'll take all the paths, all the variables, and spit them out in a list. And that's the contract, take away all the brackets, take away all the code. Here's all the resources we have, all the schemas, all the parameters. It should make sense to business users. And so involving business groups in those conversations, and I'm trying to have more, mock cycles where we're not touching code, we're not building things, we're just gonna show what's possible with existing data sets and existing APIs. And one of the cycles I'm doing right now is assessing the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I spider their whole site, find every JSON, every CSV, every XML, and every table over 5 rows. I sort them by priority, I prioritize them, and I take the first 10, and I'm gonna run through this exercise. They're paying me, they have a new procurement process called micro procurement, so it's less than $10,000, basically, if they can put it on a credit card. So I'm doing these micro procurement sessions, and eventually we're gonna do a full mock API for one of these sessions, involve the business users. We're actually excluding a lot of IT groups, honestly, because there's a lot of entrenched folks at the Department of Veterans Affairs and at the IRS. The IRS, their biggest problem is people hoarding data and not wanting to share it with each other within the IRS, which is just super fascinating. They're very adversarial, same at Department of Veterans Affairs. Everyone's like, I care about the vet the most, and I have the best data, and they hide it. So I'm actually just making these working sessions with executives and with leaders and politicians, and then some developers. There are people who like 18F out of GSA. And so really those mock sessions, getting people, show them that you can actually have a functional looking working API with docs and everything that's mocked. And you can actually build mock applications on it as well. They see the value, and then some of them get in line. Some will never change, but that's all right. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
really terrific. Can you pop that up?